having finished reviewing all of the Game Boy Color Army Men games, I decided to move on to the Game Boy Advance games, beginning with 2001's Army Men Advance, the first game released on the system. I've got a lot of mixed feelings about this one. On the one hand, it's probably the best of the handheld games released up to this point. On the other hand, it's probably the entry most likely to upset longtime fans of the series. It's just a mixed bag. The basics of the story is that, in order to foil a Tan plan to take over both the plastic world and the real world, you must allow yourself to be captured by the Tan, and then break out of a prison camp in their base. You can play as either Sergeant Hawk or Vicky Grimm, but the levels are exactly the same. The difference is little more than a costume change. Throughout the course of the game, you end up having to rescue a few of Sarge's commandos, fight some aliens, and kill a mole. Not like a spy, like a literal mole in the yard. It's weird. I'm not sure I'd say it's bad per se, but it's definitely weird, even by Army Men standards. Mechanically, it is definitely the best Army Men game released on a handheld up to this point. Movement is fluid, aiming to attack is never particularly difficult, and I never got stuck on invisible corners of objects. I almost never experienced any slowdown, and the difficulty was pretty fairly balanced. Unfortunately, the aesthetic of the game is just odd and off-putting. It doesn't look or feel like a real Army Men game. The series has never been known for its stunning realism, or its mature visuals, but this game overall just feels obscenely juvenile and cartoony. Character sprites are big, their faces are just goofy, and that mole looks like something out of one of these low-budget looking, but bizarrely well-funded, cartoons that Cartoon Network seems to be putting out these days. It just doesn't look like what fans of the series who are used to fighting villains like Major Mylar and General Plastro and Dr. Mad would expect. Again, it's not that it's bad looking, but unfortunately, as this is the first Army Men game on the Game Boy Advance, it doesn't make the best first impression for the series on this platform. The game spans 12 levels, 11 plus a final boss, and there's a good variety of locales across those levels to keep things from getting stale. The music, unfortunately, is almost non-existent. There's no background music during the levels, and the only sound effects are gunshots, Tan death screams, and the occasional explosion. It's disappointing that the earliest of the Game Boy Color games had a decent array of digitized voice lines, but the earliest of the Game Boy Advance games doesn't even have background music. Army Men Advance is very much a mixed bag. Folks unfamiliar with the Army Men series or overall neutral to it would probably think this is a solidly decent, albeit fairly mediocre game. Serious fans of the series like me, however, will likely think that it feels just odd and out of place for the rest of the series. It's a fun game for a casual playthrough, but it really doesn't capture the feel or the style of the PC and PS1 or N64 Army Men games at all. And that style, far more than the gameplay, is what attracts me to the Army Men series. It's not that expensive when I picked my copy up a couple years ago, so if you're a fan of the series or a big Game Boy Advance collector, go ahead and pick up a copy. But as with the other handheld entries, unless you are a big fan of the Army Men series or an avid collector for the system, I would recommend skipping this. There's just nothing that draws you in and really makes it worth a purchase or a playthrough for the average gamer. My rating for Army Men Advance on the Game Boy Advance is a D.